The Beatles.
They were okay. I mean, I was never as big a Beatle fan.
Which bands did Frank Zappa hate as much as among the most vocal and quirky rock history figures that Zappa never held back in terms of critiquing he discovered uninspired derivative musicians? Or simply absurd whether he was making fun of their musicianship simplicity of their marketing tricks, or their absence of uniqueness. Zappa's tongue was sharp, and a strong dislike for several bands that he thought to be the worst features of your record in the music industry. You can submit the album for the scores. Yes, I am aware that there are individuals like it, but I'm not personally aware of it. I am aware that there are a lot of them. However, this list doesn't include me enough. Therefore, will Frank check out the top 5 bands. What Zappa detested most, and the reason he had such strong views on them, that the Fab Four were the Beatles, but admired by both fans and reviewers alike, proclaiming them to be the best rock. Zappa, the band of all time, saw their impact in a very different way. He admitted their compositional skills and their contribution to the music business, but felt that their position was significantly overwhelmed. He saw the sharp contrast between his own musical prowess and theirs, one that went beyond simply their artistic ability, as well as into the field of how they were viewed by the general public. As Zappa's, the Beatles' biggest criticism wasn't not necessarily their songs, but instead that he discovered a phenomenon that enveloped them. Their tremendous appeal to the general public. They caused hysteria, and the marketing apparatus that made use of their reputation as being overly. I just assumed they were grotesque. Absurd, he once remarked. What was so they were filthy in their manner? Ate and bought everything else. I believed that the Beatles were divine. That was untrue. They were merely a good business group. That I liked the most his analogy of the Beatles to monkeys. The monkeys were very impressive. The Beatles, however, were seen as pioneers in the arts who transformed in contemporary music. The monkeys were frequently rejected as a band that was manufactured for a TV program. But Zappa noticed anything novel in their obvious. At least they were honest about their commercialism. Considering that they are a pop product, he appeared to value that candor more. Compared to the nearly holy fervor that encircled the Beatles, that he discovered intrusive, and the criticisms of misplaced. Zappa were extended. Not only the Beatles, but the counterculture movement of the 1960s. When many people thought of the hippie movement as a revolt against social conventions, that Zappa thought it had become a flimsy tendency. He admitted that some members of the movement were sincerely committed to their principles, making an effort to adapt. Yet he recognized the most as merely followers enmeshed in a fleeting trend. The monetization of hippie fashion, including tie-dye shirts with corporate and peace symbols, it was evident from sponsored rock events. Lied to Zappa about the movement's edge. In his opinion, it had transformed into an additional type of consumption that is comparable to. He hated the Beatles' craze. Mass appeal was deeply mistrusted by Zappa. In popular culture, he believed that for music to succeed in America, it had to be accompanied by a complete visual packaging, style, dance fad, and fashion. He bemoaned this fact in his statement, stating that no music has been successful in America except in the presence of something to dance to, something to wear, or a haircut. A trend isn't going to happen unless you're prepared for it. This sentiment perfectly captured his contempt for the Beatles' extensive impact. To his achievement was mostly due to their identical mop-top hairstyles and suits, since their music was the focus. In spite of his critical remarks, Zappa did acknowledge that he liked several Beatles songs in which he acknowledged their talent plainly, but he wouldn't put them on where the majority of the worlds appeared to maintain his own musical. The vision was much more innovative, adventurous, with a strong satirical foundation, almost making it impossible for him to equate to the polished pop rock of the Beatles. Confront Zappa's contempt for the mainstream market. Attractiveness was a characteristic that set him apart. He pushed the limits of rock over his career, combining jazz, classical music, and he incorporates avant-garde elements into his music. Frequently employed satire to criticize both the music industry itself as well as society. The Beatles, in spite of their personal, the occasional experimentation, never really accepted in the same manner, as his music was frequently purposefully difficult, providing commercial viability to support creative integrity of the Velvet. The Velvet Underground, generally considered to be among the finest, among the most significant bands in rock history, were renowned for its experimental and avant-garde attitude toward music in spite of their final praise from critics. However, not all of the music scene of the 1960s was particularly popular. The connection between the Frank Zappa and the Zappa and Velvet Underground were at odds, with mutual contempt originating from profound disparities in ideology and style. Their fleeting meeting point in the middle of the 1960s produced one of the most infamous conflicts in rock history. Frank Zappa, the Mothers of Youth leader, the innovative musician, invention, was well known for his intricate humorous compositions, the Velvet's technical mastery, and lyrics. Conversely, Underground took a raw minimalist approach to music, frequently adding droning sounds to poetry, themes, and lyrics about sex and urban life and drug culture. But Zappa's songs were frequently analytical and well-planned, welcomed by the Velvet Underground flaws and feelings genuineness. Their music is different philosophies established the groundwork for an inescapable conflict. The tension reached when the Velvet Underground met the head of a bill was shared by Mothers of Invention in the middle 1960s, based on folklore. Prior to the Velvet Underground performed for Zappa, said something negative about them, claimed to have said, "These men really stink." Whether this remark was made in greatest or most sincere mockery further increased the two parties' hostility camps, but not everyone can recall horrible insult that Mothers of Jimmy Carl Black, the inventive drummer, later stated that he didn't publicly remember Zappa. However, disparaging the Velvet Underground, he acknowledged that Zappa had an intense dislike toward them. One potential the cause of this animosity was the Velvet Underground's candid affiliation, Zappa's drug addiction, which, despite his countercultural image, publicly disagreed with. The Velvet was not the only target of hate. Lou Reed, frontman of the Underground, reacted with the usual acerbic, stating that Frank Zappa is the most I have never heard a musician that untalented, went one step farther and added, "He can't perform rock and roll since he's a loser." These scathing remarks perfectly captured the sharp difference between the two Zappa musicians that took pride in technical proficiency and musical sophistication, and Reed, who appreciated unadulterated enthusiasm and poetic narrative over Velvet Underground technicality. Sterling Morrison, a guitarist, also considered in providing his own harsh criticism of Zappa's opinion. Morrison said of commercialism, "If you instructed Frank Zappa to use profanity, and if it sold albums to the general audience, he would do it. If I wanted to, I would do it." His remark suggested that Zappa, in spite of his concerns about avant-garde leanings, persisted with profitability. In contrast to the Velvet Underground considered themselves to be solely creative and uninspired by this conflict between Zappa and the Velvet Underground draws attention to the profound differences within the rock of the 1960s scenery. Yet both acts pushed the rock music's bounds. They did so in essentially distinct ways. That Zappa's technically, the music was sarcastic, complex, and difficult to understand, whereas the strategy of the Velvet Underground was immersive, emotionally unfiltered, and centered on the hidden reality their shared contempt was ingrained in their society. In these variations in art as well as personal grievances, and possibly a little despite their competition, their competitive ego Frank, and the Velvet Underground Zappa's enduring contributions, that the Velvet revolutionized the music industry. The impact of the underground is audible in independent rock and punk alternative motivating future generations of musicians, who gave priority to artistic expression over technical competence in the meanwhile, Zappa's work being held in high regard for its intricacy, inventiveness, and courage. Criticism of society throughout their conflict. In the end, amusement highlights the 1960s rock's range and depth, music in which even those who didn't like each other others were influencing how the genre, each of which in turn drove Zeppelin and Led Zeppelin and Frank Zappa stand for two very distinct ways of looking at rock music and the surrounding culture, despite their undeniable influence in forming the rock landscape and role there. Beliefs, musical preferences, and public personalities were nearly completely in odds with Zappa. The modern sadists took great pleasure in dismantling the excess of rock stars, while leading the Zeppelin personified the entire event that characterized rock superstardom in the 1970s. Therefore, it might be inevitable that Zappa would object to the Led Zeppelin, especially with Robert Plant as the frontman. Not only was Zappa a musician, but he was also a composer, provocateur, and cultural critic who was impatient with the grandeur of popular rocks. Using satire in music frequently included making fun of the sector's largest performers, including Led Zeppelin. One of the most popular rock bands in terms of sales was a prime target at the time, but Led was admired by many painters of the time for their virtuosity, Zeppelin musicality, and the innovative combination of Zappa witnessed heavy rock, blues, and mysticism. Seeing them differently, their enormous sound did not strike me as much, and a legendary presence on stage, among other things eager to draw attention to their excesses in music, and one of the most notorious personal examples of Zappa making fun of Led Zeppelin appeared in the shape of his allusions to the infamous Mud Shark incident, which supposed debauchery incident involving band members, as well as a groupie at Edgewater Inn in Seattle. 1969. This tale went viral in the rock community. Mythology turned into a major target of mockery. When Zappa performs live with the Mothers of Innovation, he often mentioned the incident in his New York City performances, and it was preserved on the live album from 1971 June in Fillmore East for Zappa in 1971. This went beyond narrating a sultry tale, was a method of drawing attention to the ridiculousness and the hideous aspect of rock star excess in contrast to many of his peers. Zappa did not exalt the hedonistic way of life. Given the time period he made fun of, Zappa's insults at Led Zeppelin's influence extended beyond there. Additionally, he targeted personal exploits, specifically Robert Plant Zeppelin. In addition to his Golden Man, the frontman's soaring vocals embodied the essence of the Zappa discovered this type of rock deity archetype of a larger-than-life character ready for parody in his 1971 movie, and related Motel. Zappa mentioned Plant in LP 200 due to Robert Plant and Robert Plant names that emphasized his disrespect sentiment on the singer's alleged conceit, whereas many painters of perhaps the moment was reluctant to openly disparage a group as renowned as Zappa. The lead Zeppelin lacked such. Zappa's misgivings about Led Zeppelin wasn't founded on a straightforward distaste for their songs. Instead, it was representative of his larger criticism of popular rock culture. He usually questioned the notion that rock bands were legends untouchable, and Led Zeppelin, given their legendary reputation, it was only natural target where the mystique of Zeppelin was strong. Zappa's raw strength and devotion to the blues were all about irony and deconstruction, and intricacy of his compositions by everything from orchestral to doo-dash. Music frequently worked against the simple appeal of a group such as interestingly, Zeppelin, despite his Zappa himself, was accustomed to criticism. His works could be taken to a musical extreme. Be sophisticated, self-indulgent, and technically challenging, frequently testing the boundaries of what rock fans anticipated. Zappa's indulgence, though, was he is more cerebral than hedonistic. Wasn't drawn to extravagance for its own sake. Of spectacle, which he employed to advance artistic limits and satirize the actual. He prospered in an industry that had Zappa were ever on the same stage as Led Zeppelin or worked together in some way. It's improbable that the encounter would have been friendly. Zeppelin, especially the guitarist Jimmy Page, appropriated their image and sound sincerely, but Zappa's career was rock royalty's egos being punctured. Although each artist was a master in their own right, their ideas were just too dissimilar to match. If anything, contrast is an intriguing reflection of rock's twofold nature. One side of music in the 1970s was celebrating, the other is extravagance and mystique. Breaking things down with sardonic humor and intricacy of the Eagles. Zappa's music. The reason for the Eagles' contempt was several elements, such as their popular appeal and their dependence on polished tunes that are suitable for radio, and the way they follow a musical formula that, in his opinion, gave the mass market priority consumption over the profundity of the art. Eagles is among the top-selling bands of forever, became a representation of soft rock, and the melding of the California sound pop and country rock components combined in a way that struck a chord with millions of people, while unquestionably their music was masterfully composed and had powerful harmonics, and Zappa viewed the talented musicianship as dull, uninspired, and devoid of creativity. For Zappa, uniqueness and complexity in music was crucial to him. Profoundly impacted by classical composers like as Igor Stravinsky and Edgar Vess, as well as jazz performers who advanced the limits of musical structure, and he frequently improvises his own work, used unusual time signatures, unusual instruments and lyrics that were sarcastic and mocked society, politics, norms, and the music business itself. In contrast to his complex and frequently difficult compositions, the Eagles' song probably sounded straightforward and dependable, depending on the safe chord melodies and comprehensible lyrics that additionally catered to popular tastes. Zappa had a strong sense of independence in his approach to music. He frequently disapproved of the conventional record structures, chose to manufacture his own albums, and keep command of the Eagles' artistic output. Nevertheless, hands were well enmeshed in the corporate music machine that gains from large labels supporting widespread radio airplay, and a sector that accepted Zappa. Their polished sound as this symbolized all that was flawed. What he observed with rock music in the 1970s, as a departure from unprocessed experimental innovation in the direction of a homogeneous marketed product. Zappa's criticisms of popular culture rock was not limited to the Eagles. Frequently targeted other well-known rock performers of the time, making fun of their forecasting with business interests. He observed the growth of bands that are well suited for radio platforms and marketing through major labels' campaigns as evidence that the sector was in charge of the art instead of the artists themselves are setting the standard. In under these circumstances, the Eagles become an easy aim. They achieved great success, highly acclaimed, and their music was appropriate seamlessly into the sector's advertising blueprint. Zappa's complaints, however, were not always about the person, the technical skill or talent of musicians. However, instead of their music symbolized, the Eagles were unquestionably adept at creating high-quality, catchy rock tunes, and their popularity was evidence of their capacity for connection with listeners. But for Zappa, music wasn't solely focused on commercial appeal, was about challenging and pushing limits. The current situation and investigating new sonic options. In his opinion, the Eagles symbolized the antithesis of a safe market. Tested audio that is intended to be appealing as many listeners as you can without taking artistic chances. Punk rock is one of Zappa's main criticisms of punk rock, was it made available for purchase. Despite its posturing against the establishment, punk swiftly became a highly promoted genre. Fashion and genre record labels industries made money off of punk. Appearance of ripped clothing and spiky hair jackets made of leather, making it a mass-marketable product. This conversion from rebellion to a consumer trends that were in direct opposition to Zappa's personal principles. Zappa always mostly operated outside of the mainstream, establishing his own labels in the music industry and vigorously defending his artistic independence. He understood how corporate interests might co-opt subcultural groups and transform them into for him. Punk rock wasn't a